The applause was real. The charts were real. The number ones were real. But so was everything happening behind the scenes. The grief they were carrying, the abuse they were enduring, the illness they were hiding, the fear they were performing through.
I called you up, but you weren't there, and I was broken-hearted.
Tonight, 12 R&B legends who gave the world something extraordinary while enduring something privately unbearable. Not before their success, not after it, while it was happening. Number 12, Jackie Wilson, Higher and Higher, 1967. Jackie Wilson was, by virtually every account from people who saw him perform, the most electrifying entertainer of his era. Michael Jackson studied him obsessively. Elvis Presley called him the greatest performer he had ever seen. Berry Gordy began his music career as a songwriter, specifically for Jackie Wilson. Higher and Higher, released in 1967, hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart, becoming one of the defining records of Wilson's late commercial peak, a churning, joyful piece of soul that does exactly what the title promises.
Now once I was downhearted.
What the record label and the radio stations and the fans cheering at his shows never knew is what was happening behind the scenes at Brunswick Records throughout Jackie Wilson's entire commercial run. Nat Tarnopol, the man who had assumed management of Wilson's career by walking into a vacuum left by a deceased manager and simply declaring himself in charge, with no legal authority and no prior credentials, was systematically stealing from his artist. He placed his own songs on the B-sides of Wilson's singles, collecting songwriting royalties on every copy of every record Wilson released. He later stood accused in a federal indictment of defrauding Wilson of at least $1 million in unpaid royalties. Every night, Wilson went out on stage. He brought the audience to its feet. He was performing Higher and Higher in live shows, while the man controlling his financial life was draining his accounts.
That's why your love keeps on lifting me.
He was recording hits, while a label president was positioning himself to profit from Wilson's work at Wilson's own expense. The joy in Higher and Higher, that transcendent, gospel-rooted declaration that love has taken him higher, was being performed by a man who had no control over his own career, his own money, or his own future.
Arms around you. Honey, I can stand up.
He collapsed on stage in 1975, fell into a coma, and died in 1984 with nothing. But in 1967, in the moment of Higher and Higher, his voice carried every one of those complications, and none of them were audible. That is what he could do.
And you know he never showed his face again.
Number 11, Al Green, Let's Stay Together, 1972.
Make me feel so brand new.
Let's Stay Together was released in December 1971 and hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1972, becoming the biggest-selling single of that year.
Whatever you want to do.
It is one of the most perfectly constructed soul records ever made. Willie Mitchell's production, a masterclass of restraint, every element serving the vocal, and Al Green's vocal serving the emotion with complete precision. Green was at the absolute peak of his commercial and artistic powers from 1971 to 1974. Tired of being alone, I'm still in love with you. Call me. Here I am. Come and take me. He was releasing hit after hit, defining the high record sound, performing to enormous crowds, and being recognized by critics and peers as one of the greatest voices in American music. On October 18, 1974, a woman named Mary Woodson entered Al Green's Memphis home while he was in the bathroom. Woodson, with whom Green had been in a relationship, poured a pot of boiling grits onto Green's back and legs while he was taking a bath. She then took her own life with a gun she had brought into the home. Green was hospitalized with severe burns across his back. He was 30 years old. Several of his still-charting records were on the radio while he was in a hospital burn unit. The attack profoundly affected Green's spiritual life and sense of purpose. He had already been moving toward a more overtly religious worldview. A conversion experience had been building, and after recovering from the attack, he accelerated his shift toward gospel music and ministry. In 1976, he purchased and became the pastor of a church in Memphis, the Full Gospel Tabernacle. He pulled back significantly from secular recording for years. He became one of the few artists in history to voluntarily step away from a commercial career at its absolute peak. Not for financial reasons, but because something had fundamentally changed in him. Let's Stay Together was still playing on the radio. He was already becoming someone else. Number 10. Rick James, Super Freak, 1981.
And she says that I'm her all-time favorite.
Rick James arrived at Super Freak in 1981 with a fully formed commercial persona. The elaborate braids, the velvet suits, the motorcycle, the stage theatrics, and a voice and production style that had already delivered You and I and Give It To Me Baby as significant hits.
She will never let your spirits down.
Super Freak went to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 16 in the UK, and became one of the most recognizable records of the early 1980s. MC Hammer would later sample it for You Can't Touch This in 1990.
I really love to chase her. Every time we meet, she's alright.
Introducing it to an entirely new generation and generating a new stream of royalty income for James. But Rick James spent almost his entire commercial peak in the grip of a severe cocaine addiction that he has described comprehensively in his 2014 autobiography, Glow, the autobiography of Rick James, published posthumously. He has described using cocaine during recording sessions. He has described building it into the fabric of his daily life so completely that performing, recording, and socializing all happened inside the same sustained chemical state.
She's got incense, wine, and candles. It's such a freaky scene.
The addiction was not a secret to people around him. The record label knew. The people in the recording studio knew. The money that Super Freak and subsequent hits generated flowed into a lifestyle that cocaine consumed as fast as it arrived. James later estimated that at the peak of his commercial success, he was spending thousands of dollars a day on the drug.
Room 714, I'll be waiting. When I get there.
What makes Rick James's story particularly painful is the distance between the persona and the reality. The Super Freak persona was pure confidence, pure sexuality, pure unself-conscious joy in the music and the performance.
From her head down to her toenails. Yeah, she'll wait for.
The human being performing it was in the early stages of an addiction that would take decades off his life, reshape every subsequent relationship he had, and eventually result in a prison sentence for crimes committed during a crack-fueled period in the early 1990s.
She's a very special girl.
He died of a heart attack in 2004 at 56, his body carrying the cumulative cost of what his commercial peak had been funded by.
She's got incense, wine, and candles. It's such a freaky scene.
if you're locked into this one. Most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one.
Number 9. Teddy Pendergrass, Close the Door, 1978. Teddy Pendergrass had built one of the most extraordinary careers in soul music in an extraordinarily short period of time. He had been the lead singer of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the powerhouse Philadelphia soul group whose hits include If You Don't Know Me By Now and Wake Up Everybody, before going solo in 1977.
Close the door. No need to worry.
By 1978, his debut solo album had already gone platinum and produced Close the Door, a sensual, slow-building ballad that defined the late 1970s quiet storm R&B format and made Pendergrass the first black solo artist to have 5 consecutive platinum albums. He was selling out concert venues so fast that his management instituted a policy of women-only concerts, shows exclusively for female audiences, that became one of the most discussed and written about commercial phenomena in soul music history. Women sent hotel room keys to his concerts. His concerts regularly generated scenes of overwhelming emotional response.
Let's get lost in each other.
By the early 1980s, Teddy Pendergrass was arguably the most commercially powerful male soul artist alive. On March 18, 1982, Pendergrass was driving his Rolls-Royce in Philadelphia when he lost control of the vehicle on Lincoln Drive and struck a tree. He was 32 years old. The crash caused severe damage to his spinal cord. He survived, but the injury left him paralyzed from the chest down, a wheelchair user for the rest of his life.
Come on, get closer and closer, so close to me.
He had been at the absolute commercial peak of a career that had taken only 5 years to build. He had been preparing to record a new album. The 5 consecutive platinum records were sitting on a trajectory that should have run for another decade. He came back. After years of recovery, Pendergrass returned to performing and recording, releasing the album Love Language in 1984 and continuing to chart R&B hits into the late 1980s. He performed at Live Aid in 1985, his first major public performance after the accident, and the reception was overwhelming. He had endured the unthinkable at 32. He kept going.
I wanna give it all to you.
Number 8. Marvin Gaye, Sexual Healing, 1982.
It's getting stronger and stronger, and when I get that.
By 1981, Marvin Gaye had not released a studio album of new material in 5 years. He was living in exile in Ostend, Belgium, having fled the United States to escape a tax debt to the IRS that had reached approximately $5 million, a debt accumulated across a career of contractual arrangements that gave Motown the commercial benefit of his recordings, while giving him a royalty rate of roughly 2.7%, 1/4 of what comparable white artists were receiving.
Get up, get up, get up, get up.
He was also, by multiple accounts, consuming cocaine at a significant rate during this period. He told interviewers he had begun using the drug to manage depression. His former wife, Anna Gordy Gaye, daughter of Berry Gordy Sr., had sued him for divorce settlement. That he had famously paid for by releasing Here, My Dear, an entire album documenting the dissolution of their marriage, which he had agreed to give the royalties from. He was estranged from his children. He was paranoid and, by periods, suicidal. In this condition, exile, debt, addiction, depression, isolation, Marvin Gaye wrote and recorded Sexual Healing in a borrowed studio in Ostend, Belgium. The song hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. hit #1 on the R&B chart, and won him his first 2 Grammy Awards, Best Male R&B Vocal Performance and Best R&B Song. He was 42 years old. It was the first time he had won a Grammy. After What's Going On in 1971, after Let's Get It On in 1973, after arguably 2 of the 3 or 4 most important albums in the history of American popular music. The first Grammy came from a song written in a borrowed studio in Belgium by a man who was in debt, addicted, and in exile. He returned to the United States in 1983. He moved into his parents' home in Los Angeles. He died on April 1st, 1984, shot by his father the day before his 45th birthday. The man who made sexual healing was gone 9 months after winning his first Grammy. Number 7. Minnie Riperton, Lovin You, 1975. Minnie Riperton wrote Lovin You as a lullaby. She and her husband, Richard Rudolph, had developed the song at home with their baby daughter Maya nearby. Maya Rudolph, who would grow up to become a celebrated actress and comedian, was the inspiration for the cooing and the softness of the melody. The song was recorded in late 1974, produced by Stevie Wonder, with no percussion at all, just Rudolph's acoustic guitar, Wonder's piano, birdsong, and Riperton's voice moving into the whistle register in a way that Paste magazine would later call the greatest singing performance captured on tape. Lovin You hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on April 5, 1975. It was the 400th #1 single in the chart's history. 9 months later, in January 1976, Riperton visited a doctor about a concern and received a diagnosis of breast cancer. The cancer had already spread to her lymph nodes. She was given approximately 6 months to live. And every time that she had a 1-year-old daughter. She was 31 years old. She chose not to stay silent. At a time when public discussion of breast cancer carried enormous stigma, Riperton went public with her diagnosis and became a spokesperson for the American Cancer Society, receiving their Courage Award in 1978. She continued recording. She continued touring, performing at concerts, even as her health deteriorated visibly. She told her audiences what she was going through. She recorded 3 more albums between her diagnosis and her death. Stay in Love in 1977, Minnie in 1979, and Love Lives Forever, released posthumously after she died in July 1979 at 31. The daughter she wrote Lovin You for, Maya Rudolph, has said that growing up with the song is both beautiful and painful in ways she can't fully articulate. She was barely old enough to understand what happened when it happened. The lullaby outlived its singer by decades. Minnie Riperton's final public performance was on The Tonight Show, where she sang her songs knowing she was dying, for a television audience that could hear the voice but not the cost of it. Number 6. Luther Vandross, Never Too Much, 1981. Luther Vandross spent most of the 1970s as one of the most in-demand session singers and background vocalists in New York, the voice on dozens of jingle sessions, countless background tracks, David Bowie's Young Americans, Chic's sessions, Bette Midler's recordings. He was 30 years old before he released his own debut album, Never Too Much. His debut single in 1981 hit #1 on the R&B chart and established Vandross as a significant commercial force immediately. He followed it with a consistent run of hits and platinum albums through the 1980s and 1990s, that made him one of the most successful adult R&B artists of his generation. He won 4 Grammy Awards. He sold over 35 million albums. Throughout his entire career, Luther Vandross battled severe weight fluctuations, a struggle he spoke about publicly and in depth in multiple interviews. He would lose significant amounts of weight for tours or award shows and then gain it back, in cycles that repeated for decades. The weight fluctuations were related to emotional eating patterns and a complicated relationship with food and his own body that began in childhood and never fully resolved. In April 2003, Vandross suffered a severe stroke at his New York home. He was 51 years old and had recently completed work on what would become his final studio album, Dance with My Father, a deeply personal record about the father he lost when he was 8 years old. The album was released in June 2003, while Vandross was still in the hospital recovering from the stroke. It debuted at #1, sold over 4 million copies, and won the Grammy for Album of the Year. The album that won Album of the Year was accepted on behalf of a man who was in rehabilitation, unable to attend, having suffered a stroke that left him permanently impaired. Luther Vandross died on July 1, 2005. He never fully recovered his ability to speak clearly. He had won his most important Grammy while fighting for his life. Number 5. Aaliyah, Try Again, 2000. Aaliyah Dana Horton, born in Brooklyn in 1979, raised in Detroit. Her debut album came out when she was 15 years old. By the time of Try Again, the lead single from the Romeo Must Die soundtrack, released in 2000, she was 21 and at the absolute peak of a commercial and artistic career that was evolving in precisely the most promising direction. Try Again hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in May 2000, becoming the first single to reach the top position based entirely on airplay, without having been released as a commercial single in stores. It won the Grammy for Best Female R&B Vocal Performance. It was, in almost every observable metric, the beginning of an extraordinary sustained run. Aaliyah was recording her third studio album, Aaliyah, released in July 2001. Collaborations with Timbaland had given her a sound that critics described as groundbreaking. What was less publicly known is that Aaliyah had a documented, serious fear of flying. It was not a casual anxiety. Multiple people close to her have confirmed in interviews that she went out of her way to avoid flights when possible, and that the fear was something she managed rather than conquered. It was well known enough among her circle that it was discussed regularly as a professional concern for an artist whose career required frequent travel. On August 25, 2001, at the age of 22, Aaliyah died when the small plane carrying her from a music video shoot in the Bahamas crashed shortly after takeoff. Would you turn away or play me off, or would you stay up? The plane was reported to be significantly overloaded. She had not wanted to board it, according to accounts from people who were present. She died doing the thing she feared most, at the moment when her career was pointing toward its greatest possible heights. She was 22 years old. The album bearing her name had been in stores for exactly 4 weeks. Number 4. Otis Redding, Sittin On, The Dock of the Bay, 1968. On December 7, 1967, Otis Redding entered a recording studio in Memphis and recorded a song he had written with Steve Cropper during a houseboat stay in Sausalito, California. The song had a new structure for Redding, quieter, more introspective, less driven by the explosive gospel-rooted energy that had characterized his previous work. It ends with Redding whistling, because he hadn't written a final verse yet, and intended to come back and add the lyrics later. On December 10, 1967,
I left my home.
3 days after recording the song, Otis Redding was on a private plane that crashed into Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin. He was 26 years old. The song he hadn't finished, with the whistled ending,
Look like nothing's gonna come back.
where the final verse should have been, was released by Stax Records in January 1968. The Dock of the Bay hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on March 16, 1968, the first posthumous single ever to reach #1 in chart history.
Just gonna sit at the dock of the bay, watching
The whistling that closes the song, which Redding intended as a placeholder, became one of the most iconic sounds in soul music. The unfinished quality became part of what the song is: a man sitting watching the tide, uncertain about the future, unable to find the words for what he feels, whistling because the words haven't come yet.
Georgia, headed for the Frisco.
Everything about that moment became more resonant because he never came back to finish it. Stax had been warned in advance that the plane might be having mechanical issues. There were concerns raised about the aircraft before the flight. What happened to those concerns has been disputed in various accounts for decades.
Here resting my bones.
The Dock of the Bay was #1 on the day of Aretha Franklin's first #1 hit. Two of the most important voices in American soul music at the top of the charts simultaneously. One of them already gone.
Tell me to do, so I guess I'll remain the same.
Number 3, Whitney Houston, I Will Always Love You, 1992. I Will Always Love You was released in November 1992 as the centerpiece of the Bodyguard soundtrack. Whitney Houston's version of the Dolly Parton song, with the famous unaccompanied opening, with the key change that still makes rooms go quiet, with the final screamed note that demonstrated a technical mastery of the human voice that almost nobody else has matched. Was the best-selling single of 1992, 1993, and the best-selling physical single of all time by a female artist. It was nominated for Record of the Year at the Grammys. Whitney Houston was simultaneously in the early stages of a marriage to Bobby Brown that multiple close observers, and Houston herself, in her authorized interviews, described as deeply damaging.
So I go.
The marriage, which began in 1992, the same year I Will Always Love You was released, involved documented instances of domestic violence. Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, has described the relationship in her memoir in terms that leave little ambiguity about what her daughter was experiencing during the years of her greatest commercial success. Houston's drug use, which would eventually become the consuming reality of her later life, was already present during this period, though its full extent was not publicly known. The person delivering the most technically demanding and emotionally overwhelming vocal performance in pop music history in 1992 was simultaneously entering a domestic situation that would ultimately accelerate the destruction of her voice, her health, and her career. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, in a Beverly Hills hotel room from accidental drowning and the combined effects of heart disease and cocaine use. She was 48 years old.
Every step of the way.
I Will Always Love You was the song played at her funeral. The voice that had made it meant something she couldn't have known at the time, that every note in it was delivered in the last period she would fully inhabit it. Number 2, Donny Hathaway, Where is the Love, 1972. Donny Hathaway grew up in St. Louis's Carr Square housing project, raised by his grandmother, Martha Pitts, a gospel singer known locally as Nanny, who recognized from early childhood that her grandson had a gift that was almost supernatural in its maturity and depth.
Where is the love?
He could play piano by ear at 3 years old. He was performing gospel at church from elementary school. At Howard University in Washington, D.C., where he studied music theory and composition, he was considered by his professors to be a generational talent. Where is the Love, recorded with Roberta Flack in 1972, topped the R&B chart, reached number 5 on the pop chart, and won the Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance by a duo or group. His 1972 live album, Live, has been called by multiple critics one of the greatest live recordings ever made. His original holiday song, This Christmas, had already become a seasonal standard by the time he was 30. By 1972, Donny Hathaway was at the summit of what should have been a very long career.
Soon as you were free.
He was also, during the exact same period, battling severe depression and being hospitalized repeatedly for mental illness. Between 1973 and 1974, the years immediately following his greatest chart success, he was admitted to psychiatric facilities multiple times and eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He suffered from delusions of persecution, believing, as documented in multiple biographical accounts, that white people were trying to steal his sound. He stopped taking his medication inconsistently, which caused his condition to deteriorate further.
Where is the love?
His friendship and recording partnership with Roberta Flack suffered. They did not speak for several years. When they reconciled in 1978 and began recording again, The Closer I Get to You brought him back to the charts. But the illness was still there, still progressing. On January 13, 1979, during a recording session, Hathaway began behaving irrationally, paranoid, delusional.
Where's the love? Where?
That same evening, he fell from a window of the Essex House Hotel in New York City. He was 33 years old. The official determination was suicide. The voice that once made Roberta Flack weep with joy in the studio was gone at 33.
Oh, where is?
Number 1, Curtis Mayfield, Superfly, 1972. Curtis Mayfield spent the 1960s writing the moral and musical vocabulary of the civil rights movement. People Get Ready, Keep On Pushing, We're a Winner. Songs that told Black America it was worth fighting for itself, set to melodies that made the message impossible to resist. By 1972, now a solo artist who had left the Impressions, Mayfield recorded the soundtrack to the blaxploitation film Superfly and produced something that went far beyond what the genre usually asked of its music. The Superfly soundtrack used the film's drug culture material to critique exactly that culture: the trap of the street, the cost of the hustle. With a clarity and a moral seriousness that the film itself never fully matched. The album spent 4 weeks at number 1 on the R&B albums chart. Freddie's Dead, the lead single, hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. Curtis Mayfield was 30 years old, had been recording and performing since his teens, and was at the peak of a solo career that was only getting stronger. On August 13, 1990, Mayfield was performing at an outdoor concert in Flatbush, Brooklyn, when a stage lighting rig was toppled by a sudden gust of wind. The rig fell directly onto Mayfield as he was standing at the microphone. The weight of the falling equipment severed his spinal cord. He was paralyzed from the neck down, quadriplegic, at 51 years old. A man who had spent 35 years using his voice and his guitar to speak directly to the human condition now couldn't move his arms or his legs. He kept recording, lying on his back, the only position in which he could generate sufficient breath support for vocal performance. Mayfield recorded his final studio album, New World Order, released in 1996, line by line, in short recorded segments, breathing into a microphone while lying flat. He made a record. Critics called it one of his finest works. He died in December 1999 from complications of diabetes. The man who wrote People Get Ready made his last record lying down, one breath at a time. That is what it meant to Curtis Mayfield to keep going.